Hey everyone, Cody here with 529 Sweet. Today we're going to be talking about GitHub. GitHub is Microsoft's version control platform. If you're not sure what version control is, then you should go back and watch my video on it, which will give you a pretty good overview of what it is and why we use it in software. Just to kind of reinforce the concept of version control, you can kind of think about it as like Google Drive, right? So with Google Drive, you can create new files, you can create PowerPoints, and all of that stuff lives up on the cloud, on Google servers, as opposed to living on your local machine, your own computer. Anytime we're talking about files that reside on your computer and no one else's, we refer to that as local. And when you have files uploaded somewhere on the cloud, some other server, some other computer that's not yours, we refer to that as remote. So as Google Drive is kind of the remote repository, if you will, for your Word documents and other sorts of files and stuff on your computer, GitHub is that same thing for source code, which is what we use for software. It has a lot of other features too that are really handy for stuff like building software. So with that being said, today we're going to be talking about how you can actually sign up for GitHub, how you can use it through the VSCode IDE, and some of the key features, and more importantly, some of the terminology that is really important for you to know to be effective with using GitHub. I do also want to just note, it is totally optional to use source control, so if this is something that you feel is unnecessary for you or it's too complicated and you're just not interested, that's okay. You can still work without it and be just fine, but I just want to caution you, it is, you're kind of working at risk when you don't use version control, because if, worst case scenario, let's say your hard drive fails on your computer or you lose your computer or whatever, you don't want to lose all of the work that you put into a certain project, right? You want to be able to access that again. And stuff like GitHub is exactly the solution for that, so that you can retrieve those files in the event that you lose them, or even if you just want to access them on another computer at another point in time. Maybe you're on vacation and you only have access to some other computer and you really want to get some work done. Well, you can pull that onto whatever device you're working from, thanks to it being available up on GitHub. All right, so without further ado, let's get into it. I have the VS Code IDE open here right now, but what we're going to do is open up the web browser. I'm going to go to github.com. And in the upper right hand corner is where you can sign up. I already have an account, so I'm not going to go through this process. However, it's pretty straightforward. You just need an email, of course, your password, and give yourself a username, and you're off and running. So because I already have an account, I'm going to click sign in. And you can see this is essentially the home page for GitHub here. I'm signed into my account. Over on the left-hand side, we have this green button that says Create Repository. Well, what the heck's a repository? You can pretty much think of it as like a project, right? So if you're building a game or a web application, you're going to be storing that in a repository on GitHub. So we could create the repository right here in GitHub through their web interface, but what we're going to do today is do this all through VS Code. Another one of the reasons we chose VS Code, it has great support for stuff like this, and it has version control integrated right into it. You'll notice in VS Code that it's actually referred to as source control. That's synonymous with version control. Some people also call it configuration control. There's a lot of different words that all mean the same thing. So what we're going to do is create a new repository from VS Code. So I opened up VS Code in a folder where I just have a couple of text files. If you watched the install video on the Cloud CLI, this should look familiar. This is where we used Cloud to create a couple of different text files. The other thing I'll also mention, actually, while I'm talking about that, in that same video is where we installed a tool called Git. I want to be very clear that Git and GitHub are different, but GitHub is built on top of Git. Git is kind of the backbone of the version control, and GitHub is just a platform that uses Git behind the scenes. There's a lot of other version control platforms out there that are not GitHub that also use Git behind the scenes, so it's very important that you have that installed on your computer. So you can go back to the Cloud CLI install video and go through that process to install Git, or you can just go onto Google, search for Git, that's G-I-T, and you can install it directly from their website. But that is something that you will need to be able to move forward in this video. Okay, so with that being said, we've got a folder open. How do we turn this into a repository on GitHub? So what I'm going to do is go over here on the left-hand side of VS Code, and I'm going to click on the little icon that looks like a tree branch. It's called source control. You can see we have a couple of options here. We can initialize the repository, or we can publish directly to GitHub. So we're going to go ahead and go that route, and I'm going to click publish to GitHub. It's saying here the extension GitHub wants to sign in using GitHub. That's because I haven't actually signed into my account from the VS Code IDE. So this is saying, hey, we need you to authenticate yourself so that we know who you are and what account you're working with. So I'm going to click allow, and that's going to open up GitHub, and you can see I'm already signed in because we just did that. And it's telling me to authorize Visual Studio Code to interact with my GitHub account. So I'm going to click continue and authorize. And just like that, we're now authenticated with GitHub and we can move forward with creating the repository. So we clicked publish to GitHub, we authenticated, and you can see this drop down where it says publish to GitHub private repository or public repository. A private repository means that nobody else can see the contents of that repository, let alone that it even exists. A public repository means that anyone on the internet who has the capability of going on to GitHub can find and see the contents within your repository. So I always recommend starting with the most restrictive privacy settings, which in this case would be private. And at a later time, you can always upgrade to a public repository. So we're going to start out with private. And you can see it's asking, well, okay, what files do you want to actually include in this repository? Well, we only have a couple files here, but if you had a much larger project, you would see, of course, all of the different files and folders that make up that project. It's up to you on what you want to actually commit up to the Git repository, the GitHub repository. In this case, we're going to do both of the files. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. You can see it's starting to do something. It says it's uploading files, and it successfully published the 529SWE/529SWE Cloud Intro repository to GitHub. So if you were paying close attention, you'll notice that the folder that I opened up VS Code in where these files live is called 529SWE Cloud Intro. So it used that as the name of the repository. And you can now see in my file explorer here, we have this .git folder, and our two files are now being tracked by version control. So how do we actually see those files in GitHub? Well, if we go back to GitHub and we refresh our page, you'll see over here on the left-hand side, we now have a repository. So I'm going to click into that. And just like that, you can see those two files that were on my local computer now residing in our repository up on GitHub. That's super cool because now I can just delete the files on my local computer, delete the folder altogether, and I can still retrieve those files from GitHub. So we are now set up with version control, which is great. So let's go ahead and go through some of the important actions that you need to understand for interacting with GitHub and more specifically with Git. Let's say that we want to make a couple of changes to our files here. So I'm going to open up my hello.txt and I'm just going to make some changes. I'm going to add something here that says we're going to show our first Git commit. Great, so I've made some updates to the file. You can actually see over here in the tab for the file, it's now yellow. It has a little M next to it, which indicates that the file's been modified. That means that I have some local changes that have been made to this file on my computer that are different from what is being tracked in the remote repository. That's good to know because we can see all of the differences between what we have on our local machine versus on the remote machine. Well, how the heck do I now get this change from my local computer up to the remote repository? We're going to go through a little bit of a process called a commit. And there's a couple of steps to this to get that commit pushed up to the GitHub repository. You can kind of think of a commit as like a save point in a video game. It's a snapshot of your code or your files, your project content at a specific point in time. And each commit is something that you kind of decide as far as like what makes up that commit. What are the changes that are in that commit? You can, commit every time you make an update. You can commit every time you add a new feature. It's really up to you as to how far or how granular your commits are and when you want to make save points to your source code. I think in general, it's always good to at least make a commit once a day to save that day's progress so that you don't risk losing it the next day. But again, that's totally up to you. So how do we actually do this? Well, over here on the left-hand side, again, we can go back to the source control menu, and you'll see a couple of different things going on. The first thing I want to point out is it does have a list of the changes. So you can see we did make a change to the hello.txt. There's the option to open the file. You can discard the changes, and you can also do what's called staging the changes. This is part of the commit process. What we want to do is first stage the changes. Staging changes is essentially saying these are all of the things that I want to compile together to make a commit and make available on the remote repository. So we could also go and update another file, for example. Let's say we want to update the heading for this Claude Code overview.txt. And we'll say it's a high-level overview for beginners. But maybe we're not so sure about this yet, and we really only want to commit the changes that we made to the hello.txt file up to the repository. This is where we can kind of see what staging allows us to do. So we now see here in the changes menu, we have changes to both of our files. And let's say, again, we just want to add the changes for hello.txt. So I'm going to go ahead and click this little plus, which is going to stage the changes. We now have some changes that have been staged and are ready for commit. Every time we do a commit, we want to include a message with that commit that indicates what were the changes that we made. This is helpful both for future you to recall what changes you made at a certain point in time. It's also really helpful for other developers or engineers that might be working on the project. So I'm going to add a commit message here that says updated hello.txt for a demo. And it's always good for these to be as descriptive as possible. And I'm going to go ahead and click commit. And you can see when I hover over the commit button here, it says commit changes on main. Well, what the heck is main? If you look up here in our repositories, you can see it says we're on this thing called main branch. Branches you can kind of think of as like a working copy of your code or your files. You can kind of think of it back to the Google Drive analogy of making a copy of a file. So if I have a Word document and I want to make some changes to that, but I don't want to mess up the main copy of that file, I'll make a copy of it and I can go make changes to that copy without having any impacts to the main copy of that Word document. That's the same concept of a branch. We have a main branch, which is kind of the stable version of the code that we're comfortable with. Maybe it's tested, maybe it's actually what's released out in production, and we don't want to touch that. Everything's good there, but we do want to go experiment, go off on a little adventure and make some changes. So we can create a branch or create a copy of what's on the main branch and go off and work in the context of that branch. So again, we have no impacts back on the main branch. So when you're working by yourself, you can pretty much just work from the main branch. However, if you're going to be working with multiple developers, I strongly recommend you look more into branching to understand some of the different branching schemes that you can follow to make your lives easier as you both contribute, or many of you contribute to a project. So again, because we're by ourselves, we're just going to commit directly to the main branch, and that will be sufficient for us. All right, so we've made the commit. Now, is that actually up on our remote repository? It's not. If we actually go and look at our repository and I refresh the page, you'll see we still have the old hello.txt file here with no changes. So what does that mean? When we made that commit, that was made locally on our computer. You can make as many commits as you want locally on your computer, but they're not up on the GitHub repository until you do something called a push. the push is going to push any of the commits that you've made up to the remote repository. So how do we actually do that? Well, you'll see this little ellipses here right next to our repository. If you click on that, you'll see there's all these different actions you can do. Pull, push, clone, checkout, fetch. So what we want to do is push. When we do push, it's going to, again, take that commit and push it up to the remote repository. So now that we've done that, if we go back to our remote repository and refresh the page here, you can see 1 minute ago, there was an update made to hello.txt. You can see right here, here's our commit message that we included when we updated it that says hello, or that says updated hello.txt for a demo. We can click on the file and boom, you can see right there on our remote repository, we now have the contents that we updated locally on our own computer. And that's all being saved in GitHub now. And we can be confident that we aren't going to lose those changes. I also want to point out, note that this file here, Claude Code Overview, even though we changed it locally, it did not update the remote repository because we never staged that change to our local area to be pushed up. So that's why that still looks like it. The other thing I want to point out is if you notice here, you'll see that the last commit that was made on this repository was by 529 Sui. If you haven't used Git before, most likely you're going to run into this step in the first time where you actually have to tell Git who you are, right? So in Google Drive, when you sign up for Google Drive, it knows who you are because you're signed in with your Gmail account or some other account. With Git, you need to tell it who you are. So how does it know that I'm 529 Sui? Well, that's because some time ago I told it I'm 529 Sui. So how do we actually do that for you? Well, if you go into the terminal here, again in the upper left area of VS Code and go to new terminal, what you can do is you can type git config user.name. And you can see here my username is 529 Sui. You can also type git config user.email, and you can see here is the email that I am using for Git. So this is me telling Git who I am and who to excuse me, make these commits as. So if you haven't done this yet, and I'm sure you might have already ran into this earlier when you tried to follow along in the video, you need to tell Git who you are. So you can do something like git config user.name, and then you can say this is my name. And if I press enter and then do git config user.name again, you can see my name has actually been updated now to this is my name. Of course, that's not who I want to be, so I'm going to go back to 529 Sui, but this is how you tell Git who you are, and this is something that you will have to do if you haven't already done it following along in this video. So that's just something I wanted to point out. Okay, so what have we done so far? We created a repository, we pushed it up to the GitHub repository, and we made some local changes to our file. We committed those changes, and then we pushed those up so that they are also available on the local repository. Well, what happens if I want to pull changes that someone has made to the source code? So let's say I'm working with another engineer and they made some updates to a file, and I want to retrieve those updates locally on my computer. Well, the old school way of doing it, they could just take that file, they could beam it over to you over email. You could then download the file from your email, and then you could copy it into your repository and replace the existing file that you already had in your repository. That's one way to do it. You could totally do it, but I promise you that's going to get really old. And as your source code gets really, really large because you're building something really freaking cool, that's going to be a terrible workflow for you, and you're not going to want to do that. You're going to want to do everything through Git. So how do we actually do that? Well, let's go back to our repository in GitHub, and let's actually make a change to the hello.txt file. So I can click on the file, and directly from GitHub's web interface, I can make an edit to the file. Over here on the right-hand side, there's this little pencil, and we can click Edit File. And I'm going to say, I am making an update from the GitHub repository. And just like we did in our local environment, we can also commit from the web interface. We have our commit message that says we updated hello.txt, And again, we're going to commit directly to the main branch. So I will click commit, and you can see that file has now been updated, and we can get ready to bring that onto our local computer, right? Because this was only on the remote repository. So if I go back to my local copy of the repository, you can see we still have our old version of this file that don't have the changes that we just made. So how do I get those? Well, back in the source control menu, another one of the things we can do with the repository is called a pull. And this, just as you can imagine, is going to pull the changes from the remote repository onto our local repository. So if I run pull, we should expect to see hello.txt updated with what's on the remote repository. And just like that, you can see we now have the text that we added there. Great. So now we know how to push, we know how to pull, we know what a commit is. What else do we want to know about Git? There's, I will say, two other things that are important to know about Git. One of them is the concept of a merge conflict. Now, if you're just working by yourself, you probably can ignore this and skip past this part of the video, but it still is good to know, especially if you plan to work with multiple developers at some point in time. At the highest level, so a merge conflict is when, let's say that I'm working with another developer and we are both making changes to the source code, and we happen to both edit the same file and specifically the same text within a file. So developer A does that. They push it up to the remote repository. I am working on that same file on my local repository, and I make an update to the same stuff. Well, when I do a pull, Git doesn't know, well, should I take the updates from developer A or should I take the updates that you've made locally? How do I resolve that? So you have to tell Git how to resolve that merge conflict. It wasn't able to do the merge, so it needs help figuring that out. So what does that actually look like? Well, let's go ahead and simulate that. So as we did earlier, we made some updates to Claude Code overview.txt, and we added the for beginners to the end of the header here. Well, let's say that some other developer also edited that same file. So I'm going to go back into my remote repository. I'm going to go to the Claude Code overview.txt, and I'm going to click edit. And let's say I wanted to also update this, but I wanted to say for the beginners instead of for beginners. I'm going to commit these changes. We have our commit message. We're committing directly to main. Great. I've updated the file. Well, let's say I want to go back to my local repository, and let's say I needed to pull from the remote repository. What we're going to see is there is something called a merge conflict. And actually, you can see here it's saying that that we need to clean our working tree before checkout. Well, what does that mean? Let's open the Git log. And you can see that it attempted to pull the stuff from the remote repository, and it said your local changes to the following files would be overwritten by a merge. Please commit your changes or stash them before you merge. Okay, so what we're going to do before we do that pull is we're going to do something called a git stash. So how do we actually do that? Well, what we're going to do is go to the ellipses next to the repository, and we're going to do stash. And what this is going to do is kind of just revert our local version of the files back to what is on the remote, but it's going to stash those changes that we made locally off into another area while we work out our conflicts from the remote. So I'm going to go ahead and stash, and I'll just press enter. We don't need to include a message with that. I'm going to go back now, and I'm going to do my pull. Now you can see we pulled what came from the remote repository. We have Claude Code high-level overview for the beginners. And what I want to do now, though, is go back to where I stashed my local changes, and I want to bring those back into the repository here. So I'm going to go back to the stash menu, and rather than stash, I'm going to go down to pop stash, which is going to take the changes that I had stashed earlier, pop them off, and place them back into our local repository. And we can pick what we want to pop from the stash. So I'm going to click that there. And just like that, you can see, look, we have a merge. What's great is the VS Code IDE has a pretty good interface for walking us through how we actually resolve the merge conflict. So what are we looking at here? On the top, you can see we have the current change, which is what was pulled from the remote repository. You can see we have Claude Code high-level overview for the beginners. And then we also have an incoming change, which is what came from our original local changes that we stashed away. We popped it off the stash, and now we're bringing it back to our local area. So let's say I want to take my changes. I had a conversation with developer A that made the other changes, and we both came to the agreement that instead of for the beginners, we're going to leave it as high-level overview for beginners. So I'm going to tell Git that we want to accept the incoming change, which was my original local change, and I want to save it. And now we need to tell Git basically that we resolved the merge conflict for that particular file. So how do we do that? Well, we can just go back to our source control menu here, and what we can do is click stage changes, and we will enter our commit that we resolved a merge conflict with the remote. And what we're going to do is click commit. And now we have that change and that merge conflict resolution staged for commit. So now what we're going to do is push that up. And like I said earlier, you can use the ellipses over here to do that, or you can just press this sync changes button, which is telling you that this action will pull and push commits to and from main. So I'm going to click OK. And what we should see now is this will get pushed to main. We can go back to our remote repository and take a look at that file. And excuse me, and you can see that it is now our original update that we made. We resolved the conflict. Everything is good. Now, that might have been a little bit complex, but I just wanted to point out that that is one of the key actions that Git allows you to leverage for managing your source code, is resolving merge conflicts between you and other developers. Again, if you're working by yourself, you're not working with other developers, you will not have to worry about this, and you can totally ignore this. But again, if you are going to be working on a development team, that is an important concept for you to understand. And if you want more info on it, there's plenty of other YouTube videos out there that further dive into different ways that you can handle merge conflicts. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to show is a Git clone. So we started from an existing folder and we created a new Git repository and we pushed that up to GitHub. Well, what happens if I want to maybe get someone else's repository onto my local machine, or maybe I wiped my hard drive and I need to go grab the repository that I already had before I wipe my hard drive and bring that back onto my local computer? How do we do that? Well, let's go ahead and go through that process. So you can see here in my folder where I have this kind of demonstration at, I am going to go ahead and delete it, except it's not going to let me because I have VS Code open, so I'm going to try again. And you can see we just deleted the folder. So I no longer have this repository now locally on my computer. Well, that's okay because GitHub is storing it up on its server. So I can clone this repository back onto my local computer. So from the root of the repository, or the home page of the repository, there's this green button in the upper right that says code. In it, you have a URL over HTTPS, and that URL can be used to clone or pull that repository onto your local computer. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that URL. And what I'm going to do is go back to my file explorer, and we're going to do the clone to pull it onto our local machine. So there's a couple ways you could do it. You could open up VS Code in this folder, and you could do it through the terminal on VS Code, or you could just right click here in your file explorer, open in terminal, and we have the Git executable installed. So you can type Git and you can see all of the different arguments that you can pass to Git to do different things. One of them is git clone. So that, of course, like I mentioned, is to clone a repository into a new directory. And by default, it's going to use the directory name that comes from the repository name. So what I'm going to do is type git clone, and then I'm going to paste using Control V the URL to that repository into the terminal, and I'll press enter. And what that's going to do is, again, it's going to clone the repository onto my local computer. So you can now see down here at the bottom of my file explorer, we have a folder called 529 Suite Cloud Intro. That is the new cloned repository. If I refresh it, that'll bring it back up to the top. And I can go back into that, and you can see there are my two files again, right back on my local computer. So now we know how to create a new repository. We know how to push changes to a repository. We know how to pull changes from a repository. We have resolved a merge conflict. We have cloned a repository. You're pretty much an expert with Git now, and you know pretty much everything you need to know. Now, you can kind of see that it's a little bit tedious working with Git, and we're doing kind of all of this through the source control menu in VS Code. That's one way to interact with Git. Another way is just through your terminal. There's the command line interface like we just did for the clone, where you use the git executable. And another way you could do it is just, well, through Claude Code. Claude Code is very well versed in Git, and so everything that we just did, you can have Claude do for you. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a new session here, and I'm going to ask Claude to create a new file and then commit and push that file to the remote repository. So let's see that happen. Create a new file called some new file.txt. Add the text hello from Claude to the file, and then I'll say commit and push the file to my repository. And let's see what Claude can do with that. It's coalescing, it's thinking what it needs to do, and because again we are running Claude in kind of the safe mode, it's going to ask us if it can go ahead and proceed with creating new files and running some commands. So we're going to allow it to do that. Now it's getting into the Git portion of this. It's asking if it can run some Git commands to go ahead, stage, commit, and push that. It's going through with those commands, and now it wants to actually run the push command. And we can see that it just pushed that new file to that main branch. So if we go back to our remote repository, we refresh the page, we should see, there we go, that new file. And you can actually see that it committed that as the Claude user. So we can go ahead, and there is the hello from Claude. Now, again, this is a little bit tedious. You're specifically asking Claude to go ahead and commit the files and push them up to the repository. If you want a kind of sneak peek into a more efficient way, you can do this through something called a / command. I highly recommend you go watch my short video on creating a / command for git commits. What this will allow you to do in the future is, instead of asking Claude to make the commit, do the push, yada, 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 you can just do something as simple as a / commit, and Claude will know what to do with that to go ahead and collect all of your changes and push that up to your GitHub repository for you. Again, that's going to be in my short video on creating a / command for git commits. So go check that out. Happy building, and we will talk soon. Thanks.